This video is brought to you by GiveWell. A couple of months ago, we did a video on why the UK economy was doing surprisingly well. In that video, we noted that inflation was falling below the Bank of England's 2% target, and that GDP growth, which has been basically stagnant for the previous few years, was actually performing rather well, thanks to robust growth in the UK's services industry, which looks relatively well placed to weather the coming geopolitical storm. But unfortunately for us Brits, since we did that video, the UK's economic fortunes have reversed somewhat. Inflation has ticked back up, thanks to yet another spike in energy prices, and the latest ONS data suggests that GDP growth has once again stagnated, with GDP per capita actually falling in the last few months. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the UK's subpar economic performance, and explain why this is all pretty terrible news for the new Labour government. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop when we release new videos. So let's just get straight into the latest ONS data, which was released last month and covers the third quarter of this year, running from July to September. According to that data, GDP rose just 0.1% in that time, and actually contracted in September. This is well down from the 0.7% we saw in the first quarter, and the 0.5% we saw in the second quarter, which were the numbers that inspired us to write that video about why the UK economy was doing surprisingly well. It's also behind basically every other peer economy, a reversal from the start of the year, when the UK was growing faster than most of the G7. For context, the US grew by 0.7% in the third quarter, France grew by 0.4%, and even Germany, whose economic woes have been well documented in the international press, grew by 0.2%. The UK's slowdown was mostly driven by its services sector, which accounts for the vast majority of its economy. Strong growth in services is what drove the relatively high GDP growth we saw earlier this year. But services grew just 0.1% in the third quarter, down from 0.6% in the previous two. This has corresponded with a slight decrease in the UK's service-based exports, which is sort of the UK's economic speciality. It's rarely mentioned, but the UK is actually the world's second largest exporter of services, which includes stuff like banking, management consultancy, and law, behind only the US. Now, of course, this is bad enough in and of itself, but to make things worse, these GDP figures flatter the real state of the British economy. In fact, once you account for the recent increase in population, driven by record-breaking immigration numbers, the UK's GDP per capita actually fell by 0.1% in the third quarter. This means that, if you account for inflation, the UK's GDP per capita is still 0.7% below its pre-pandemic level, and the UK is one of the worst-performing economies in the G7 by this metric. For context, the only other G7 countries in this situation are Germany and Canada, where GDP per capita is still about 2% below pre-pandemic levels, while France, Japan, Italy, and Germany have all seen real increases in GDP per capita since. To make matters even worse, there has been an even steeper decline in the UK's productivity, that is, the economic output per hour worked, which fell by 1.8% year on year. It's hard to overstate quite how bad this is. The fact that the UK's GDP is rising, but GDP per capita is falling, and productivity is falling even faster, implies that the UK economy is only growing because there are more people and they're working longer hours. This is sort of the opposite of what we want. Ideally, economic growth would mean people being better off, making more money and working fewer hours, but the reverse is apparently happening in the UK. Anyway, the silver lining you might expect here would be for weak growth to mean low inflation. After all, weak growth usually means weak domestic demand, which means less pressure on prices and therefore lower inflation. Unfortunately, that's not happened either. In fact, having fallen below the Bank of England's 2% target in September, in October the Consumer Price Index, the most popular measure of inflation, rose by 2.3% year on year, the highest in 6 months. Whilst this was mostly driven by yet another increase in energy costs, after the UK's energy price cap for household bills was raised by nearly 10%, core inflation, which strips out volatile items like food and energy, also rose more than expected, to 3.3%. This is the measure that central banks pay most attention to, because it better indicates the risk of a so-called wage price spiral. And the fact that it came in as high as it did means the Bank of England is now less likely to cut interest rates in the near future, presenting yet another drag on GDP. To make matters worse, British households shouldn't expect relief anytime soon. The OECD currently predicts that inflation in the UK will average 2.7% in 2025, the highest in the G7. Now, obviously, all of this would be bad news for any government, but it's particularly bad news for Starmer for two reasons. First, weaker than expected GDP growth means lower than expected tax revenues, which means more emergency borrowing to make ends meet. And that's exactly what's happened. According to ONS data, the government had to borrow £13.7 billion in August alone, about £2.5 billion more than forecast, taking the government's total borrowing for 2024 to over £60 billion, and the UK's overall public debt to GDP ratio to over 100% for the first time since the 1960s. This puts yet more strain on the UK's public finances, which weren't in good nick in the first place. But second, all this data is very much at odds with Starmer's pledge to achieve, quote, the highest growth in the G7, a pledge he has repeated on numerous times on the campaign trail. While these weak growth figures are hardly Labour's fault, although the doomerism around the budget probably didn't help, this pledge was always a bit silly because, well, A, generating growth is obviously really difficult, and B, whether or not Starmer can keep this promise depends on what the other G7 economies are doing, which Starmer obviously has no control over. Anyway, not only is the silliness of this promise becoming very apparent, given the UK is currently struggling with some of the lowest growth in the G7, but it also very much limits Labour's room for manoeuvre. For context, during the campaign, whenever Starmer or Reeves were pressed on how they would afford all the investments they promised, they ultimately fell back on the claim that they'd have the highest growth in the G7. And Starmer specifically said he wanted an annual growth rate of 2.5%. With 2.5% growth, investing in public services would be very doable. Not only would that naturally mean higher tax revenues, but with their incomes rising, households and companies would also tolerate a heavier tax burden. With basically zero growth, however, this all gets a lot more difficult. Now, when you make a big purchase, say a car or a new mattress, how do you make sure that you're making the right choice? You could rely on all of the marketing copy in the product's ads, but many people find they need an independent resource that's rigorous and trustworthy. Today's sponsor, GiveWell, provides that independent resource for a different kind of purchase, a donation. For 17 years, GiveWell has been researching charitable organisations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. That's things like bed nets to prevent malaria. It costs about $5 to provide one net. Nets can reduce the number of malaria infections. Enough nets and a large enough drop in infections can save a life in expectation. Together, over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. I particularly like GiveWell as it ensures that your money is doing a lot to help those the most in need. Here at TLDR, we're big believers in doing research to find out what's really going on, and that's exactly the approach that GiveWell takes to charities. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube, then enter TLDR News at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or to find out more.